times. And what this bill does, Mr. Chairman, is to clarify that when this body has used the term sex in the code over the years, it was referring to male, female, man, woman, boy, girl. Clarity is an essential characteristic of a statute, and both for judiciary purposes and for purposes of making sure that Tennesseans know how to act with regard to these statutes, it's important that a law be clear. And what this definition does is it essentially provides that the term sex, as used in the Tennessee Code, refers to one's biological sex as determined by anatomy and genetics as evidenced by one's birth certificates. So for those reasons, Mr. Chairman, we submit respectfully that this bill has substantial merit and should be passed by the committee.
Thank you, Representative Bulso. And Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative Bulso, I appreciate you bringing this legislation. It is one of those odd things that you would think possibly would have been defined somewhere in the past, but I would submit that it hasn't been because it was common sense. It was from the beginning of time, the beginning of the creation of man, that it was understood. And I appreciate you bringing this. Thank you.
Chairman, Chairman Todd, I agree wholeheartedly. We do unfortunately live in a day and time where terms that have always been understood in one way are now being used in ways that historically and by convention they have never been used. And having a term, the definition of a term locked down in the code to give clarity to the judicial branch and to citizens, we think is worth a significant merit.
Thank you. And without objection.
I live in Cannon County. The idea that doctors looking at babies' genitals or in rare cases chromosomes can make definitive conclusions about sex or gender is fundamentally flawed. There are at least 15 intersex conditions, and according to Nature magazine in 2018, as many as 1 in 100 people have differences or disorders of sex development, some of which mean that their genitalia cannot clearly be classified as male or female. In 1 out of every 1,000 births, doctors have surgically altered an infant's ambiguous genitals to match whichever sex was easier and expected the child to adapt. Frequently, they were wrong. A 2004 study tracked 14 genetically male children who were given female genitalia. 8 ended up identifying as male, and the surgical intervention caused them great distress. Now, the International Olympic Committee has struggled with this question on how to determine sex for decades. Genital exams were intrusive and humiliating. DNA tests checking for the presence of a Y chromosome were not reliable either. People with XY chromosomes can have female characteristics owing to conditions including an inability to respond to testosterone. Genetic recombination can transfer Y chromosome genes to X chromosomes, resulting in people with XX chromosomes who have male characteristics. And certain medical conditions can raise women's testosterone levels to the typical male range. I want to talk about a field of study called epigenetics, which is looking at how genes are expressed based on a variety of molecular processes. A 2018 article in Gynecologic Oncology concluded that both sexual orientation and gender identity are biologic features conferred onto a fetus during pregnancy based on genetics, epigenetics, and a whole host of other biological factors. A small study reported in Frontiers of Neuroscience in 2021 looked specifically at the epigenetic function called DNA methylation, which helps determine which genes are turned on and off. This study found that transgender and cisgender people have different CpG methylation profiles that turned on and off genes related to sex and gender. These studies show that gender identity is an innate biological process, but not one that is easily summarized by a mere genital examination or simple chromosomal testing as doctors do at birth. So using national estimates for intersex and transgender populations, we have between 37,000 and 114,000 people here in Tennessee whose gender may deviate from what doctors assigned on their birth certificate, and who will be harmed if this bill passes. When someone sees a gender marker on an ID that clearly doesn't line up with the person they see in front of them, people may choose to discriminate in housing or employment. A trans friend of mine told me of a time she was pulled over just for a traffic matter, and because her ID said male, because the state wouldn't let her change it at the time, police policy mandated.
Ms. Purvis, that's your 3 minutes, but we got time for questions. Any questions for Ms. Purvis? Representative Bulso.
Ms. Purvis, thank you very much for appearing here this afternoon and for your testimony. I have one question and then a few follow-ups, if I could, Mr. Chairman. First, you agree and understand that the word sex is used hundreds of times in our Tennessee code, correct?
Ms. Purvis. Hit your red. Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
I do, and actually sometimes it's referring to male, female, sometimes it's referring to the sexual act of intercourse, so it's actually unclear in any direction.
Representative Bulso, you're recognized.
Sure. Are you aware of any evidence, Ms. Purvis, to suggest that when the General Assembly has used the term sex in the code, that it was referring to something other than male, female, man, woman, boy, girl?
Ms. Purvis.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
Representative Bulso.
Sure. You've already told us correctly that the term sex appears hundreds of times from Title II through Title 71 of our Tennessee Code, correct? And my question simply is this. Are you aware of any evidence to suggest that when the General Assembly used that term in a statute, it intended to refer to something other than male, female, man, woman, or boy, girl?
Ms. Purvis.
What I am aware of is that in over 19 states, and including on the federal level, that they are using third genders, that it go beyond male and female to either be agender, non-binary, or undisclosed. So I believe that there are more than two genders, and our state should recognize that.
Representative Bulso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That doesn't quite address my question. Let me just approach it this way, Ms. Purvis. When I stop talking, I'd like you to list for me every piece of evidence you're aware of to suggest that when the General Assembly used the term sex in the Tennessee Code, it was referring to something other than male, female, man, woman, or boy, girl.
Ms.
What you're doing now is proposing a definition which has not existed in the Tennessee Code, so I can't imagine what they might have meant at that time, and what I believe at this time is that if we were to try to define sex, that it should not be written the way that you have written it, and that it should include the reality that people are intersex and transgender.
Representative Bulso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One final question. Do you agree, Ms. Purvis, that it would be appropriate to define the term sex in the code in accordance with the manner in which the General Assembly has used it over the years?
Ms. Purvis.
There are many terms in the Tennessee Code that are undefined. I was speaking on a bill last week about male and female impersonation, which has not been defined and has been left open for ambiguities. So I do not believe that if we are going to define a term at this point, that we should ignore the medical and social realities of what sex means in this day and age if we are defining it today.
Representative Bulso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Purvis.
Thank you. And Representative Beck, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Purvis, for being here today. I was interested, first of all, what happened to your friend who was pulled over, who her ID said male, and then your 3 minutes was up when you were talking about pulled over. What happened then, please, ma'am?
Ms. Purvis, you're recognized.
You know, it was a humiliating and physically violating experience that I would classify, you know, as harassment. She said that the police officer was aware of trans protocol, but by policy was forced to do this. She was able later to go to a state where she was able to change her ID. But what I understand of this bill is this will prevent people from being able to have an ID that matches their gender reality, and instead will be locked down to what a doctor at the time, using very basic visual techniques of genital examination, said as their gender. So I think that protection that she has right now of not being harassed because of having a gender that is matched in her ID is going to be stripped back from her and many other Tennesseans in this state.
Representative Beck.
I was very interested in what you were talking about with intersect and the 1 out of 1,000. I noticed that in House Bill 1 that's brought this year about gender reassignment before you're 18, that it carves out a exclusion for those type of surgeries when you're born, if there is the problem with identification of the sex. And so I really appreciate you talking about that for the committee to hear, because sometimes things are just not black and white as they seem. And thank you very much.
Ms. Purvis, would you like to follow up?
Yes, thank you. I do have research, if anyone would like to see it, of they did a medical review of 40 years of the medical record at Brown University and came up with statistics for, like I said, over 15 different intersex conditions and their frequency that they occur. And that's where some of these statistics are drawn for. I have all of this reports that I have cited. I can make those available to anyone on the committee, and we'll email them to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. Did I hear you say a while ago you think that there are more than two sexes?
Ms. Purvis?
According to medical experts at this moment, they are reclassifying gender as a spectrum that, yes, has more than male and female.
Chairman Grills?
How many are there?
Ms. Purvis?
It is a spectrum, which, as any other type of thing that's not a concrete number, there's male on one side, female. Some people are not in the middle. Some people have mixed characteristics. Some people are born with XXY chromosomes. So I'm not sure, how would you classify that?
Chairman Grills?
I feel that Chairman Todd referenced this early on. I know over in the Bible, I'm a Christian, have a Christian worldview, and I feel that we're going down a road that seems to be an attack on the very character of God. That God created man and woman, and every time that we try to, as society, move away from God, we're going in a direction that is not conducive. We're not in the right direction, in my opinion. And I have the district that I represent feels the same way I do. At least the overwhelming amount of people that have reached out to me feel the same way that I do. But I feel like when we attack God, we're not going in the right direction, and the very nature of God is being attacked. And I appreciate you, Mr. Bulso, for bringing this.
Ms. Purvis, would you like to follow up?
Yes, please. Thank you. I believe that God created every human being, and that includes every gender that is out there. And I am here to represent people where I live and people like me, and I live in Cannon County. It's a rural county. And so I would just humbly ask you to take into account that I'm also representing people. And God has created all of these biological processes that I've just talked about. So I believe that we would be honoring God's creation by recognizing the diversity in gender.
Thank you. And Representative Parkinson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. So, based on the studies, what actually determines sex? And then another question is, are we actually talking about the sex of a person, or are we talking about the gender of a person?
Ms. Purvis?
Both. That's why there's intersex conditions and there's transgender conditions. What does go into sex? There are hormones, right? There is anatomy. There is external anatomy. There's internal anatomy. So a lot of these different situations that happen. So let's say your body produces testosterone, but you have a condition in which you cannot react to the testosterone. Your body will end up having what we would consider feminine characteristics. So I'm just saying that there are lots of different things going on in people's bodies that's not clearly this or that, and that's why allowing for a spectrum, and that person, as they develop, as their different adrenal systems and hormonal systems develop, they will come to understand which direction, if any, that they feel most represents them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming before us today. Going back to the first part of your testimony, was it 1 in 1,000? Did I hear that correctly?
There are a lot of different statistics, but yes, 1 in 1,000 births result in a genital alteration surgery happening as an infant to conform, because the genitals weren't clearly seen as male or female, so they wanted to change them to make them look like more one than the other.
Representative Kaplan?
So I don't have all the statistics and the numbers in front of me, but are you suggesting that this committee that is responsible for the decisions for 7 million Tennesseans make decisions based on 0.001% of the population? Is that?
Ms. Purvis?
I'm saying that what I can tell is that there are up to 14,000 people that this would be directly harming, and I have seen no evidence for who, if not passing this bill, would be harming. So in my idea of doing nothing, there's nothing that's I'm sorry, I'm having trouble explaining myself. I'm saying
No,
I
you're
can
fine.
see clearly the over 100,000 people who would be negatively impacted, but I'm not sure who would benefit from this bill ever passing. So I think knowing people that would be harmed by making an alteration and choosing a definition that excludes them and exposes them to harassment, violence, and discrimination over not making that choice is a clear benefit.
Representative Kepley.
And I'm not being rude when I ask this. I'm just genuinely curious. Can you? What do you mean by being harmed? What is that? And I'm not. I don't have any kind of bias. I'm genuinely curious. What do you mean by that?
Ms.
Well,
Purvis.
yes. So if, say I, had an ID that said something different and I go to a bar, right, and people seeing that, we know that there's a lot of violence against transgender people right now. And so having to, even if somebody has, appears as one gender, but their ID says something else, when their privacy gets violated by having to show an ID at all the bars, airports, public places, that puts them in the hands of whoever might have a bias against transgender people to enact violence upon them.
Representative Kepley.
I'm still struggling with the violence and the harm perspective. Are you just meaning in form of vocally, or are you assuming that people would commit some kind of physical assault on someone who might identify? I'm still confused.
Ms. Purvis.
Yes, I don't have all the statistics on violence against transgender people on me right now, but I would hope that you are aware that is a problem, that there is a specific attacks on transgender people simply because they are transgender.
Representative Kepley.
I'm a little concerned that we're moving away from the standard here, especially in the bill. It says evidence of a person's biological sex, and it seems that we're moving away from that and going toward this feeling aspect. And I'd like to propose an example to you, and I'm not going to ask you what your age is because I don't want to do that. But I would assume that you are less than 80 years old. That would be my assumption. So my question to you would be, why are you not 80 years old?
Ms. Purvis.
I was born in 1979. That's why.
Okay. So biologically, you are not 80 years old.
Ms. Purvis. Representative Kepley. All right, Representative Eldridge, you are recognized. All right, seeing no further question, Ms. Purvis, thank you so much for being here. It's appreciated that you came down to speak. All right, we're going back in session. And Representative, all right, y'all are welcome to stay, but you're going to have to be quiet. Question's been called. All those in favor of sending House Bill 239 to Civil Floor signify by saying aye. Noes signify by saying no. Ayes prevail. Civil Floor. I had to think about that for a second.